Hi there, this is Elizabeth from the University of Iowa Office of the State Archaeologist. It is officially Iowa Archaeology Month, so we are doing, excuse me, I'm just muting some other things here, but we are doing a series of live programs for Iowa Archaeology Month, mostly because it's just safer this way and we get to reach a whole lot more people. So, our Director of Archaeology, or sorry, Director of Bioarchaeology, Dr. Lara Noldner, is kicking off our first presentation. She's going to talk about Iowa's laws that protect ancient human remains. And Iowa, of course, was the first state to have such protections in law, so it's pretty special. With that, I'm going to disappear, but I will also be watching for questions. So, in order to type a question, all you do is you just put it in the comment box on Facebook or YouTube, and we'll save those questions towards the end of the program, and I'll help moderate a little bit of a Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lara and add her presentation to the stream.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today, and thanks Elizabeth for inviting me to present on the live stream this month. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm just going to be talking about kind of all the pertinent parts of the Iowa Code that protect ancient human remains in Iowa, as well as other non-ancient remains, and then kind of in that process go through how we operationalize all these parts of the code. So I'll apologize in advance, it's a little texty, but I just kind of wanted to highlight the parts of the code that are relevant to the state archaeologist and my program by extension. So the bioarchaeology program's mission is threefold. So we focus on research to ensure that we do thorough data collection and reporting anytime there are inadvertent discoveries of ancient remains or burial sites reported to us. We also do a lot of focus on education, through events like this, to foster stewardship of burial sites and ancient human remains throughout the state. I don't know if many of you know, but the vast majority of Iowa is privately owned, so we rely a lot on Iowans to help us in the protection of these important sites and people. So the only way we can hope to foster that stewardship is through education. And then, of course, we uphold our state and federal responsibilities towards the protection and proper treatment of ancient human remains. So as Elizabeth also mentioned, our laws are very unique in that they were the first burial laws to protect all human remains regardless of antiquity or cultural affiliation. So I'll go through all these sections of the code, but did want to highlight first kind of the founding members of the Iowa Code and kind of by extension my program here at the State Archaeologist Office. Maria Pearson here is Yankton Sioux, and Don Wanatee is from the Meskwaki Nation, and they were instrumental in starting these laws rolling and getting them enacted. This is their picture here with Governor Robert Ray, who was the governor at the time that the laws were passed. So it's kind of a culmination of a lot of mistreatment of ancient burial sites throughout the country. The American Indian movement and a lot of just proactivity about getting better treatment for Native American remains and burial sites throughout the nation. And there was a few pivotal moments, but one in particular was when there was a burial site in Mills County that was impacted by road construction. And it was a cemetery that included both Native and non-Native, so European American settlers. And all the European Americans, were taken to a cemetery and immediately reburied, and all of the Native individuals were taken to the university. And Maria was the one that kind of initially heard about this and marched into Governor Ray's office and demanded that this change. And so she and Don Wanatee were instrumental in in starting the ball rolling with our legislation. So again, sorry for the textiness, but I'll go through all the pertinent parts of the code. So Chapter 263B names the state archaeologist as having the primary responsibility for investigating, preserving, and reinterring discoveries of ancient remains. As you might imagine, that's a big job for one person, so my program was created to assist the state archaeologist in that responsibility. This part of the code also defines ancient as over 150 years old, and those are the jurisdiction of the state archaeologist, and non-ancient remains are the jurisdiction of the Department of Public Health. As you can see, a kind of rolling deadline of 150 years as the cutoff for ancient gets us into both Native American burial sites and more modern cemeteries, even active cemeteries at times. Technically, some of the graves would fall under the ancient category. So we kind of have to, depending on the situation, work with county medical examiners, overseers of cemeteries, and kind of anybody who needs to be involved in different cases. And then this part of the code also requires that we do all the archaeological and osteological documentation and file our reports with the Department of Public Health. Our code was also pretty unique in that it required establishment of a cemetery for reburial of ancient remains. And so it did start as one, but in trying to get individuals back to as close to their original burial location as possible, 4 cemeteries have been established, and we're actually kind of working towards the establishment of another one here soon. And we also can rebury on site if that is safe, and we can ensure the protection of those remains in perpetuity, but in any case, they have 4 cemeteries for reburial of ancient remains. And we're actually working, this year is pretty unique. We have reburials at all 4 of our cemeteries, and we've done 3 of those and are working towards our final ones at the end of the month here. So this part of the code also gives the state archaeologist the authority to deny permission to disinter ancient remains. So basically, if there's a project where a substantial burial site or even isolated remains are encountered, and there is no way to avoid that spot, and in consultation with our Native partners and other descendant communities, we decide that they have to stay where they are. The state archaeologist can say you cannot excavate them and kind of have to figure out a different location for any development. And then the section 685.11 kind of operationalizes all of that I just mentioned to you. So the state archaeologist is the appropriate agency to contact regarding discovery of ancient remains. We're also to be notified of areas believed to represent ancient burial grounds, and that is a big portion of my tasks over a year, is to either investigate mound sites, possible mound sites, or just get known cemeteries, even family plots on our maps, just so everybody, just so we have a good record of all the burial sites in Iowa. Anytime that I go and investigate a burial site, we never do any testing that in order to verify that there are remains there. We know from just past experience that oral history of family plots and pioneer cemeteries are pretty good indicators of burial sites. And then, as you're all probably aware, mounds are a primary feature here in Iowa as burial sites. So the same applies for mound sites. A lot of folks always ask me, well, not all mounds were burial sites, right? And I say, well, technically, some were either kind of waymarkers or architectural features, but the vast majority, and in our experience, were burial sites. And in any case, they are sacred and important locations to Native groups. So we never go so far as to have to prove the existence of human remains in order to protect a reported burial site. We can do geophysical surveys, and those have been a really good way to non-invasively determine site boundaries. Lots of people have done are doing more work with surveying mounds in this way and actually getting a really good picture of different stratigraphy even without any excavation. So it's pretty amazing, and I think as just technology advances, it'll just get better, and we'll just get better images of burial sites. In the only case that I would do any little type of excavation is to determine whether a mound is a natural land formation or was constructed. So at minimum, I'll do a 1-inch diameter soil probe to just compare the stratigraphy of a mound to the natural stratigraphy and compare to see if it was constructed or not. A lot of times new different sediment would be built up into mounds, and in any case there was some mixing of soil when mounds were created, so we can often see that just in a small soil probe. This part of the code also requires that we maintain records of all known or suspected burial sites, and we do that through our Iowa sites file and then my program files. So the Iowa sites file is a database of all known archaeological sites in Iowa, and we've worked with our IT folks here, Colleen Randolph and Mary De La Garza, to actually create a red flag layer for that. So red flagged sites are those that contain human remains or are likely to. So that's been a really good advance to that database in kind of highlighting sensitive areas. That database is only accessible to archaeologists and tribal historic preservation officers. So we don't disclose exact site locations to the public, and I'll get to it at the end, but there is a public version of iSites that you all can explore. And then my program files basically consist of any investigations that we do, from mapping mound sites to inadvertent discoveries to any consultations we do on development projects near burial sites. So the iSites file is kind of the way that we are notified if, say, a project is near sensitive areas. And if so, then I'm brought into the consultation process, and I keep track of that. We have over 3,600 of those files now, since my predecessor, Shirley Shermer, started back in the mid-'80s and up till now. So a lot of work has been done over the years. This part of the code also gives us the authority to coordinate activities pertaining to ancient burial grounds to foster their protection, but does not necessarily mean we have the fiscal responsibility for those activities. So if it's just myself going out to document, say, a cemetery or a mound site, that's the purview of my program, and we don't contract for that kind of work. We don't charge landowners for that kind of work. But if there is more substantial excavation required, in any case, it would be up to the developer or landowner to finance that. And then there's two different things that are punishable by law, basically, in relation to ancient burial sites and human remains. So the first is that it's a misdemeanor to fail to report finding human remains. And then the second is intentionally disturbing known burial grounds without lawful authority. So, and then it also sets the penalties for those. Our code is also unique in that it is required that we have an Indian Advisory Council. So I would guess that while many states kind of followed the lead in establishing burial laws, they didn't build into the whole process necessary consultation with tribes. And so we have kind of several renditions, as I mentioned. Maria and Don Wanatee were original members of the advisory council, and unfortunately, Don just passed away a few years ago, or sorry, this past year. And I was just wanted to say that I was very honored to have gotten to work with Don and learn from him what I could. So basically, we work with I think the code says that there has to be 2 Native individuals who are residents of Iowa, and we've also expanded that to tribes outside of Iowa. So we have a member of, so Lance Foster of the Iowa tribe, Suzanne Wanatee of the Meskwaki Nation, Jackie Rand is and Joe Coulter are actually affiliated with the University of Iowa. Jackie's just left us for the University of Illinois, but she's still on the council. And then we have a individual from the Spirit Lake Nation, Eric Longy, that advise us now. So we meet several times in a year to just keep everybody apprised of our projects and the ongoing consultations we're working on, and just get their feedback on everything that we are working on in a given time frame. One of the things I usually get asked is, if a burial site is documented on my property, can I get compensated for that loss of property? And this case, Hunziker versus the state of Iowa, actually set the precedent that having a burial site on private property is not a taking. So it's not something that means that you need to be compensated for a loss of property. And then in the case of inadvertent discoveries, so human remains are often exposed from natural processes, erosion, especially along riverbanks and road cuts. Tree falls can also expose human remains, and then again, just natural time and erosion of the ground surface. But also, of course, ground disturbing activity like the picture you're seeing here. So we try to, there are steps that have to be followed if there is an inadvertent discovery, especially at a construction site. Namely that the area has to be, all ground disturbing activity has to stop. The area needs to be secured so that those remains aren't impacted anymore. And then the local law enforcement can help, it needs to be notified basically to help protect the site. And then the state medical examiner and our office needs to be contacted. Especially if there's not clear designation of ancient versus non-ancient, and then we'll kind of hash that out after our investigations. The big thing is all remains need to be left in place. If it's an instance where it's just a natural road cut or a natural river channel or a road cut that has exposed human remains, I have my contact info at the end, and if you have any instance like that come up yourself, what I would ask is just to keep those remains protected and do the same contacts just to protect them, and then I can, of course, come out and investigate as soon as possible. Given, depend on the circumstances, whether we need to have remains temporarily picked up for safekeeping or not. So it just depends on the situation, the safety of a situation. But then, of course, if they are determined to be ancient, we would begin see what we could tell of their context and time period, and if there's determine whether they're native or non-native, and then go about consulting with the appropriate descendant communities for the next steps. Until then, you would decide, their proper disposition, reburial, repatriation. We would need to make sure that those remains are safe, so they are reposed here at the OSA. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, the state archaeologist has the ultimate authority to say, we can't disinter, we have to just leave things as they are and figure out a different plan. The picture that you're seeing here is something we definitely don't like to walk into. This was a case where locals were kind of telling me that we know of this burial cemetery on top of this hill, and we want, we see that there's lots of earth moving going on up there. We know there's a cemetery there, please help. So I asked to be present to monitor, and sure enough, there were ancient remains that were impacted, and we were basically able to just kind of stop everything with the city involved, have the area recovered with clean fill and reseeded with grass. So this was for a parking lot expansion. It wasn't super vital to any infrastructure, so we were able to pretty easily get that cemetery just put back and mark it as a no disturb zone from there on. And in that case, so that if you know of like ARPA and NEPA, all the sort of federal legislation that requires people to get archaeological testing done ahead of any ground disturbing like this picture here. That is only when there's federal funding or a federal agency is doing the project. So a lot of private projects, county, city areas where, even on private property, that might not be, required, and people wouldn't even know to have to go through any archaeological testing or scoping ahead of time. So what we recommend for those kind of situations, and try to get out the word that folks can figure out what's in an area, and therefore help them avoid any inadvertent discoveries of burial sites. So we do have, as I mentioned earlier, the public access version of iSites. So if you go to our the Office of the State Archaeologist webpage and go to our iSites page, there's this public access link, and if you click on that, you can kind of zoom a big map to any part of Iowa that you're interested in, and then this will give you indication of sites. So any blue colored sections have one or more archaeological sites documented. As I mentioned, we don't disclose actual burial locations of burial sites, but we have kind of numbers per section. And then this site, also these blue dots are all historic, historic structures, and then also give you established cemeteries. You can kind of see some down here that are, probably modern and still active cemeteries mostly. But then the big thing is, if there's a section with archaeological sites, it's a good idea to contact our database manager, Colleen Randolph, and she can run a site search that will then, so you basically provide her with a location of your proposed ground disturbance, and she can do a site search to figure out what's there. And if any known burial sites are within a mile, I'll be brought into the conversation, and we can go about working on plans for avoidance of these sites. A lot of people fear that this would then just negate their project, and not necessarily. We're not, we don't try to stop development. We don't try to just shut things down. We always are happy to work with within an area and just advise on the best practices for buffer zones and avoidance measures. So I'm kind of running down towards the end of the presentation, but I guess I should back up and just also highlight our federal responsibilities towards the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. As you know, our Iowa Code is started in 1976, and we kind of had an informal process essentially for, actually informal in the sense that it didn't require, reporting and publication of notices like NAGPRA does, is what I meant by that. So we would work with the descendant communities of and the appropriate stakeholders for any human remains that were in our possession to work towards the proper disposition or reburial, repatriation of those individuals. But then in 1990 is when the federal legislation was passed. And our code was actually a good example for the national legislation or federal legislation. And it basically requires a more stringent process of just having a full inventory of your museum's collections that include human remains, funerary objects, sacred objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. And then you are to determine if the cultural affiliation of those, if you can, and notify the appropriate tribes of what you have. And so this was kind of like, what we have done in the past, but not in specific reporting requirements. And then once, everybody knows kind of what you have, then tribes or stakeholders tribes for National NAGPRA can claim those remains or funerary objects and then go about the process of reburial. So it's just kind of the added steps that we have to do for our processes. We were kind of unique too in that since we had our process for reburial and repatriation before NAGPRA, when NAGPRA was still trying to figure out what to do with culturally unidentifiable remains, so basically remains that we couldn't determine a subset of descendant communities to consult with, we kind of said, well, this is how our process works in Iowa. We established an agreement with National NAGPRA with all the tribes basically as signatories to this agreement. And we basically just renewed that a couple of years ago. And we have 26 signatory tribes to that agreement. So NAGPRA has made a ruling on culturally unidentifiable remains and how that should work with their process in the meantime. But before that, we kind of said, well, here's how we do it. Can we just keep doing it this way? And so that's kind of was preliminary work to the reburials that we're working on this summer, spring and summer. So yeah, I think I'll just end by my presentation and open it up for discussion here by just saying that if you know of any burial sites, pioneer cemeteries, mounds, possible mounds, even just a cemetery you know of through oral history, please do contact me and we can see what we have on file already. Maybe we already have it documented, maybe we don't. And yeah, I would just open it up to our discussion if anyone has questions.
And I'll help moderate some of the Q&A. We don't have any questions yet, and we can bring back up the slides if anybody has questions on a particular slide. But I just want to emphasize that it is really remarkable what Iowa has. We have some of the strongest burial protection laws in the country, and of course, we were the first to develop them. And we often hear from Indigenous people across the country that they wish that their state had what Iowa had. So we're very proud about the relationships that we've built and the collaboration that we do and the protection that we afford descendants of Iowa. So don't be shy.
Yeah.
If you have any questions about our burial laws, about the NAGPRA process, about what it's like to work with Indigenous tribes descendant to Iowa, both in and in neighboring states, just go ahead and ask. And if not, we will wrap this up in a few minutes. And we'll just say hello to the people watching on Facebook and YouTube. I know Lance Foster, the TIPO for the Iowa Tribe of Kansas, Nebraska, is out there. And so he's just asking a question. Can you highlight or bullet point the differences between federal and Iowa burial laws?
Um, so the one big difference between NAGPRA and our burial laws is that NAGPRA only applies to it only provides protection or I guess just language for how inadvertent discovery should be handled, maybe not even necessarily protection of ancient burial sites. Basically, any inadvertent discoveries on federal or tribal lands are the ones that it provides guidance on how to um, assess those situations and consult with tribes and determine the next best steps. So it's kind of I would say the biggest bullet point between the two is that NAGPRA is way more limited in the protections it provides to um, burial sites in the ground. It's mostly, I think it was mostly driven towards um, making museums more accountable for what's in their collections and making sure that they're transparent in what they have in their holdings and working towards repatriation of those items and human remains. So yeah, I think our burial laws are better for protection on the ground and prevention of uh, burial site disturbance. Um, but NAGPRA also does provide some guidance on inadvertent discoveries. But again, on very limited portions of land, and especially here in Iowa, as many of you know, we have very little federal land and tribal land.
So Lance has a follow-up. Would you say the one thing then would be that Iowa laws are more widely applicable, such as on private lands, whereas NAGPRA is not generally on private lands?
Right. Yep. hmm Really, the only way that NAGPRA would apply to remains on private lands is if they came into the holding of a museum or institution under NAGPRA's definitions. So,
Thank you, Lance.
yes, thank you.
Any more questions in the next minute or two? If not, we'll start to wrap this up. Looks like we've had quite a few people watching, so thank you for that. And thank you for Lara for being the first to volunteer to go for another series of live stream programs. Um, here's one question from Facebook. How often, if ever, do you encounter stone-covered burial mounds?
That's a very good question. I have actually never myself seen a stone-covered burial mound. I'm not sure. But yeah, I don't think so. I have never seen or heard of one in Iowa. How about, have you, Elizabeth? Or
No, is that something that would be more common in other states, maybe more out west?
possibly, yeah, or they do like care and burials or things like that. But yeah, I don't think as far as my knowledge goes that there are any in Iowa.
Yeah, we have plenty of soil in Iowa.
Or if there are, then they're covered up with soil, and we don't know that they're stone covered. Maybe.
Thanks, David. So just, oh, and Lance says there are some in Kansas, um, but none that we know of here in Iowa. And I believe, didn't the Boon Mound have quite a bit of stone inside of it?
Yeah, I think stone kind of construction inside of burial mounds was common, but then a lot of soil was piled up on top of that.
Then we have some comments about the Hunziker decision. So Bill Green, former state archaeologist of Iowa, says it was a fairly resounding 4-1 vote, and then recently the Wisconsin Supreme Court also upheld preservation of the mounds on private land. And a little bit earlier, John Dorshek noted um, that the Iowa Supreme Court upheld the ruling of no taking. So very strong laws.
Yeah.
So just wait and see if any last questions come in. But next week on Monday, we're going to do a live Q&A with Veronica Mraz from the Office of the State Archaeologist. So she's not going to do a formal presentation, but she is an expert on lithic tools and flint knapping. So any and all questions you have about stone tools or making stone tools, you can tune in and ask Veronica. So we have one more question. Any comments on the discoveries around Council Bluffs? Haven't heard much. What I did here was very interesting. Do you know what he's referring to?
I am not. Was it recent discoveries or?
So Jason, if you could just comment with a little bit more details. You know, Western Iowa is pretty active around the bluff, so it's hard to know exactly um, which discovery this might be.
Right. Definitely lots of um, pioneers moving through, lots of Mormon settlements. And then obviously before that, the Luss Hills were very common for cemeteries, ancient and um, after that. So
Okay, so more details. A large village being mapped via ground mapping radar.
I guess I'm not familiar with that work being
Yeah,
done.
there
So
honestly, there's so much work that goes on in Western Iowa by so many different
yeah.
archaeology organizations.
hmm And I know of a few, like actually, university in Utah was doing a lot of that a few years back. I'm sure there's groups from Nebraska as well. So
And so the situation that Lara talked about in the beginning with Don Wanatee and Maria Pearson, that was in the Glenwood area just outside of Council Bluffs in the late 1960s, early 1970s. That was Highway 34. And so Colleen just pipes in, we have over 30,000 sites currently recorded in Iowa. So one of many. A question from Christy Rickers on YouTube. Has Iowa addressed the possibility of burials associated with Indian boarding schools in the state?
that's a good question. We have not gone extensively into kind of the boarding schools that we have recorded. I can say that kind of in our general knowledge, we're not aware of any. That doesn't mean there aren't, but it certainly is an avenue for that needs to be researched, just given the in light of recent events and the need to address those cemeteries if need be. Yeah, if anybody has any leads on um, cemeteries associated with boarding schools, I'd be happy to look more into those.
And I'll just retype in Lara's email address into the comments. So, yes, we would definitely love to hear about any leads pertaining to Indian boarding schools. So, I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Again, we'll be back with another live program on Monday. So, all the questions you want answered about lithic technology with Veronica Mraz. So thank you again to Lara for this presentation. This video will be available both on Facebook and YouTube for you to watch at your leisure at any time after the program. So thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.